Mrs. Anne Grant-Lewis, thank you so much for speaking with us here on SABC News.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The Secretary-General's policy brief on education during COVID-19 and beyond tells us that this pandemic has created the largest disruption of education systems in history, affecting nearly 1.6 billion learners in all countries and all continents, and warning of a generational catastrophe. What are the stakes at play here?
Indeed, I think that the stakes are very high. Prior to COVID-19 pandemic, education systems around the world were facing serious disparities in access and retention and a learning crisis. But the pandemic has exacerbated all the disparities that we've seen and threatens a whole generation of children and youth.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about those disparities. You correctly point out that it exacerbates the pre-existing conditions, if you will, for use of a better term. People who are poor, those in rural areas, girls in particular, persons with disabilities, those that are forcibly displaced, often minorities. You warn that some 23.8 million children may drop out or not have access to school next year due to the pandemic's economic impact. Just talk to that, if you will.
Yes, indeed. This is a new figure based on UNESCO's projections, looking at the world globally. So the data set includes all countries in the world. And we have looked at the economic impact that the pandemic is having on families and children. And we are concerned that given what we already know about the likelihood of dropouts, that the economic impact is going to add to that. It's really a huge concern.
So the policy brief calls for action in 4 areas. The first one is reopening schools and says that once local transmission is under control, getting students back into schools as safely as possible must be a top priority. Would you agree, though, that this is a very delicate issue and therefore very complex for governments, for communities, for families to grapple with? This conversation about how we get our kids back in school safely, it's not very easy, not a straight line.
No, but we do have good guidance to help countries and education systems to reopen. The top priority is to safeguard the lives and welfare of all populations. So there's no push to reopen too soon. The opening line is suppress the transmission of the virus so that we can then prioritize the reopening of schools. I think what the Secretary General has emphasized in this brief is that education should be among the country's top priorities in the reopening. And maybe that choice should be made above some of the other sectors or aspects of society.
Let's take my country, for example, South Africa. We saw a gradual reopening of schools in early July, only for the government to order them closed later in July for a month due to community spread in the country. In the United States, you have the politicization of a pandemic that has complicated science-driven outcomes and created real tensions with teacher unions, for example. What can you say about this, given your expertise at UNESCO?
Well, it is important not to politicize the reopening of schools. What we know from previous crises is that building the trust of all the education stakeholders is really key. Through the pandemic, we have seen all the stakeholders rethink their whole role. Parents, as our first teachers, have been back in the role of teachers. We need to ensure that we have the trust of parents, of community members, of education personnel, and that governments can protect them. But there's the prerequisite of ensuring that we've suppressed the transmission. The reopening and then closing again, I think, unfortunately, we're going to see this repeatedly throughout the world. I think that many countries are in a protracted pandemic with protracted school closure mode, and that some will have to may be able to reopen in some parts of the country, not others, etc. What's really key here is that that governments are trying to track the progress of the virus and keeping communication, coordination with education authorities at all levels in place.
The brief also talks about prioritizing education in financing decisions, calling for education budgets to be protected and increased. How critical a factor is this, given the context that countries are already stretched fiscally, budgets are so under strain, countries are having to take loans from the IMF to fill their balance of payments? How critical is this prioritization given the constraints that we all face?
Right. And so we would say maintaining, paying attention to the health issues is number one priority. But let's also recognize how education systems are suffering throughout the world. With the pandemic, a lot of resources have been siphoned off from education in order to put in place health measures to try to stem the virus. And that is completely understandable. But we must recognize that to reopen, we also requires resources. And our argument, the Secretary General's argument, is that by reopening schools, we are helping to rebuild. It will help address some of the economic needs. Education sectors are a large economic sector, but it will also ensure that we have some protection and special services for the children and youth who are most vulnerable.
So it thirdly calls for targeting those who are hardest to reach, and fourthly, to reimagine what future education looks like, part of the Build Back Better philosophy that we've heard from the United Nations in the context of COVID-19. To quote the SG, we have a generational opportunity to reimagine education. Explain what that means.
So social sectors generally are often slow to change, but what we have seen during the pandemic is an incredibly rapid response from governments all over the world, from stakeholders, partners, development partners or local partners, really helping out to try to ensure continuity of learning. And all sorts of innovations and experimentation has been taking place. It has not all gone well. We know that there are exacerbated disparities. The most vulnerable are not able to continue their learning. But the experimentation, we need to build on this. Through the pandemic, we saw that change can happen. So let's rethink, let's reimagine what education systems need to be. That last recommendation has a number of sub-recommendations because we're really thinking through how to move forward on this.
Yeah, and the digital divide jumps to mind immediately, right? Within countries and between countries, not so?
Indeed it is. And so the brief calls for including in the definition of the right to education, a right to connectivity, and the importance of breaking down the barriers to connectivity. In today's world, that digital divide really needs to be bridged.
Suzanne, final question for you. Alongside this policy brief, you guys have also launched the Save Our Future campaign. What does that entail?
So Save Our Future campaign is a campaign that highlights the futures of young people. It includes lots of testimonies from young people, and it is a campaign that will go into the fall when we will have, we'll be releasing a white paper, a research white paper with a wide range of international partners. And we hope that will continue the momentum into the global education meeting with which the ADG for Education has spoken about, because I think we need to ensure that we're getting this momentum. It's really a sign of the whole education community coming together, focusing on the future.
Let me give you the final word. What do you want the takeaway to be here? You know, from this interview, from this policy brief, people are watching this, parents are watching this, community activists, teachers, unions are watching. What's the message that they should that you really want to resonate in this discussion?
There's never been a more important time for all who care about education to be active, to play a role. Try to do what you can do to ensure that learning is continuing and that we can reopen schools safely and in a more equitable and sustainable manner than we've had in the past.
Suzanne Grant-Lewis, thank you.
Thank you very much for your time.
Suzanne Grant-Lewis is Director of UNESCO's International Institute of Educational Planning, in conversation about the launch of the Secretary General's policy brief on education during COVID-19.